The first time my mother referred to my company as our business in front of other people, everybody laughed like she was joking, including me. That was probably my first mistake. We were at my aunt's barbecue, standing near the grill, while my uncle struggled with charcoal that had clearly been soaked by the morning rain. Somebody asked what I'd been working on lately because I'd missed 2 family dinners in a row during a warehouse software rollout for a shipping client near the port. Before I could answer, my mother smiled proudly and said, "Oh, our business has been keeping him busy lately." Everybody laughed. My uncle pointed at me and said, "Look at you making the family rich." The conversation moved on immediately, but I remember standing there holding a paper plate of overcooked chicken with this strange flicker of discomfort I couldn't fully explain yet, because technically nothing she'd said sounded serious enough to challenge publicly. That became the template for the next 2 years. At the beginning, there wasn't really a company anyway. Just me, one laptop, a folding desk, a secondhand monitor that randomly flickered blue whenever the apartment wiring overloaded, and enough caffeine running through my system that I probably shortened my life expectancy by several years before 30. I worked warehouse consulting contracts during the day and built logistics management tools at night, because after enough years inside shipping operations, I became convinced most small warehouse systems were held together with spreadsheets, panic, and misplaced confidence. The idea started in a freezing loading dock office at 2 in the morning, while a freight supervisor screamed into a phone about inventory mismatches nobody could explain. I remember staring at 3 different spreadsheets across 2 monitors, realizing the entire operation depended on employees manually updating information that should have been automated years earlier. That night, I went home and started sketching software concepts on the back of unpaid electricity notices sitting on my kitchen counter. For almost a year afterward, nothing happened quickly. That's the part people always rewrite once success becomes visible. They remember the outcome and forget the dead space beforehand. Back then, my life mostly looked like exhaustion. 4 or 5 hours of sleep on a good night. Consulting contracts I hated because they paid just enough to keep development moving. A tiny apartment where the heater barely worked during winter unless I kicked the side panel hard enough first. Some nights, I genuinely questioned whether I was wasting years chasing something that would quietly fail while everyone pretended not to notice. My mother certainly thought so, though that part disappeared completely once the company started making money. In the beginning, she hated the whole idea, not aggressively, more dismissively. She called it my little software thing at every family dinner. She said I worked too much, that I was obsessed, that normal people slept, that I should focus on stability instead of gambling on something that wasn't guaranteed. Meanwhile, I was spending every spare dollar trying to keep the project alive long enough to maybe become real someday. Around that time, my apartment lease ended unexpectedly after the building was sold to a developer, and suddenly I needed somewhere temporary while trying not to kill the business financially at the same time. My parents let me move back home for a few months. That phrase became critically important later, because in my mother's future version of history, this moment represented the foundational sacrifice that apparently entitled her to partial ownership of the company forever afterward. The actual reality was considerably less dramatic. I stayed in my childhood bedroom for about 6 months, continuing warehouse consulting during the day and coding at night, paying part of the utilities, buying groceries, helping with repairs, mostly staying invisible. And living there was emotionally exhausting long before it was financially helpful, because my mother simultaneously criticized the business to my face and bragged about it to relatives, depending entirely on who she was speaking to. To me, you need a backup plan. To other people, Nathan's building a tech company. That contradiction confused me for a long time until Maya explained it in one sentence. She likes the idea of your success, Maya told me once. She just doesn't like that it belongs to you. At the time, I laughed. Later, I realized she was exactly right. During those 6 months at home, my mother loaned me about $3,000 total spread across a few genuine emergencies. A server payment once, software licensing, 1 month where a client delayed payment long enough that I almost missed payroll for the freelance developer helping me remotely. To be completely fair, that money mattered back then, and I never denied it. The problem was what happened to the memory of it afterward. In her mind, temporary help during the survival stage slowly transformed into permanent emotional equity. The loan became investment. The spare bedroom became co-founding. The casseroles became contributions to company culture. The transformation happened gradually enough that for a long time I kept treating each individual comment as an exaggeration rather than as part of something more deliberate. The company moved forward slowly, painfully, in the way things do when you're building something real with limited resources and no safety net. My first employee was Luis, a burned-out inventory coordinator who agreed to work part-time because he liked the automation tools I had built for his previous warehouse. He said they were the first logistics tools he'd used that seemed like they were designed by someone who had actually worked a warehouse floor, which was the best professional compliment I'd received up to that point. Then came Jenna for customer onboarding, then Amir for back-end systems. We operated out of a tiny industrial unit near the docks with terrible lighting and heating that sounded like dying machinery whenever it turned on, and we signed small contracts first, then medium regional contracts, and then one logistics chain expansion changed the company trajectory in a way that felt almost violent in its suddenness. One week we were worried about making payroll. The next we were looking at an office building and trying to understand how we had gotten there that fast. That was when my mother's language around the business started shifting noticeably. The criticism disappeared first. Then came the pride. Then came the ownership language. She started introducing me to people as my son who runs the company I helped start, rather than simply her son who worked in software. The first few times I let it go because technically she had helped me survive the early stage financially. But over time the story kept expanding. She funded the beginning. She kept the business alive. She believed in me when nobody else did. That last one especially bothered me because it was objectively false. She had not believed in the company during the beginning. She had tolerated it while loudly doubting it. Tolerating something and believing in it are not the same thing. But once success becomes visible publicly, people tend to rewrite their own uncertainty into foresight because nobody likes remembering they doubted something that eventually worked. About 4 years after moving out of my parents' house, the company signed a major warehouse automation contract with a regional shipping distributor large enough that we needed a real office immediately. Not shared industrial space, but a real office with glass meeting rooms and conference space and actual branding on the walls. I remember standing inside the empty building before renovations started feeling this overwhelming combination of pride and terror because suddenly the company was large enough to fail publicly instead of just privately. That was also around the time my mother stopped referring to the company indirectly and started inserting herself into it openly. She requested office tours for friends. She began bringing up expansion plans at family gatherings as though she were part of the strategic conversation. Then one night at dinner, while I was talking about future growth, she casually said, "Well, obviously my name should eventually go on some of the paperwork too." The table laughed. But this time she didn't laugh with them. She just looked at me and waited for an answer. And for the first time I realized she might not be joking at all. A few days later she called while I was reviewing onboarding documents with Jenna and asked whether the new office would have her own parking spot once renovations finished. I assumed she was still joking. Then she asked whether her title would technically be co-founder or advisory partner. I remember staring at my phone while Jenna slowly pretended not to listen from across the conference table. I asked what she meant. "Well, I was there at the beginning," she said, and the certainty in her voice, no humor, just settled expectation, unsettled me in a way I hadn't felt before. I tried explaining carefully that emotional support and legal ownership were very different things, especially inside a company handling contracts, liability, payroll, and investor relationships. She sighed and said I always made things sound so cold. What I had described as professional clarity, she immediately reframed as emotional rejection, which became the recurring structure of every conversation that followed. Business boundaries became personal cruelty, professional structure became betrayal, legal separation became proof I had become someone unrecognizable. The problem was that the company kept growing fast enough that I barely had time to process the family tension before another crisis appeared somewhere else. We hired 4 new employees in less than 6 months, expanded 2 regional warehouse contracts, and started negotiations with a distribution group large enough that success would essentially double the company within a year. And with every visible milestone, my mother's emotional attachment to the business intensified proportionally. She started introducing herself socially as part of the business. At first, this happened mostly during family events. Then it spread farther. One afternoon, Maya came home from meeting a former coworker downtown and asked casually whether I had given my mother an executive role she didn't know about. When I asked what she meant, Maya said my mother had told someone at a marina restaurant that she helped build the company and still advised operations. I laughed at first, then noticed Maya wasn't laughing, and that moment stayed with me because the situation had crossed from embarrassing family exaggeration into something professionally dangerous. The confirmation came from Luis, who knocked on my office door one evening and asked whether my mother was supposed to be talking to vendors. Apparently, she had stopped by the office that afternoon while I was across town, spent almost 40 minutes walking around introducing herself to employees, and chatted with a delivery systems contractor waiting in reception, referring to the company throughout as our family business. I leaned back in my chair slowly, because I could suddenly see the trajectory with uncomfortable clarity. If this continued, clients would get confused, employees would get confused, vendors would get confused, and eventually my mother would become fully convinced her authority was legitimate simply because nobody had stopped her early enough. I drove to my parents' house that evening already raw from a full day of work and 3 separate calls about delayed inventory sync failures. And I want to be honest that I knew I should wait until morning and drove over anyway, partly out of exhaustion and partly out of something less reasonable. A need to say something that evening rather than carry it home and lie awake with it, which I recognized even at the time as emotionally poor strategy, but did anyway. My mother was at the kitchen counter sorting coupons when I arrived, and she smiled and said, "How's my company doing?" in a way that landed differently now than it had a year earlier when it just seemed like harmless pride. I sat down across from her and said she couldn't introduce herself to vendors or employees as though she were involved in ownership. The smile disappeared instantly. She said, "Oh my God, Nathan," then said I was acting like she embarrassed me. And before I finished explaining that wasn't what I meant, the conversation had already moved to a completely different place. Not about behavior, but about character, loyalty, gratitude, the emotional infrastructure my family always defaulted to whenever a factual argument started losing ground. I said carefully that she had loaned me money years ago and let me stay temporarily, that I was genuinely grateful for that, but that it didn't make her an owner of the company. The kitchen atmosphere changed after that sentence. Not louder, just colder. She set the coupons down and stared at me. "You really believe you did all this alone?" she said. And it wasn't quite a question. And that was the thing about how my family argued. They stopped discussing behavior and started discussing your morality instead, so that defending a professional boundary suddenly made you selfish, arrogant, ungrateful. My father walked in halfway through the argument carrying iced tea and froze, sensing tension. My mother continued, saying everyone knew she helped me start it. And I said that was different from ownership, and she asked why I was so obsessed with ownership. And I remember looking around their kitchen thinking, because it's my company, my risk, my payroll, my liability, my years. I want to be honest that the conversation didn't resolve anything. She believed early sacrifice permanently suspended future boundaries. And I think part of her genuinely believed that rather than performing it as a tactic, which was what made the whole situation emotionally complicated. She was controlling and manipulative, yes, but underneath that sat something real. She honestly believed that early support entitled her to lifelong emotional ownership afterward. The difference between those two things, a tactic and a belief, matters because you can argue someone out of a tactic, but you can't argue someone out of something they've built their entire understanding of the relationship on. A week later, Maya finally said the thing I had been avoiding admitting even privately. We were on the apartment balcony late at night with takeout noodles from cardboard containers, harbor lights reflected across the water below, and I had spent most of dinner distracted by Slack messages from Amir about a warehouse integration failure. And at some point Maya put her chopsticks down and waited until I looked up from the screen. "Do you realize your family talks about the company like inheritance before you're even dead?" I said that was dramatic. She said it was accurate. She wasn't angry when she said it. She'd learned a long time ago that getting angry at my family dynamics on my behalf mostly just made me defensive. She was just precise. Then she explained something I had apparently been too emotionally conditioned to see clearly. Every single conversation about the company inside my family eventually became a redistribution discussion. Who deserved jobs? Who deserved help? Who deserved access? Who deserved influence? Nobody ever asked what was healthy for the business itself, because they had stopped viewing the business as separate from the family emotionally. They had absorbed it, the way families absorb things, and once something gets absorbed like that, it doesn't come back cleanly. I sat with that observation for a long time after she said it, turning it over, looking for the part where she was wrong. I couldn't find it. That conversation kept replaying in my head over the following month, while tensions escalated quietly in the background. Then the office launch detonated everything. The launch event was supposed to be simple, a small evening gathering for employees, clients, vendors, and local partners who helped us survive long enough to finally move into a space that didn't smell like overheated wiring and warehouse dust. We rented a waterfront event room connected to the building lobby. For most of the evening, it honestly went well. Luis got slightly drunk and started telling exaggerated stories about the old warehouse office heater trying to kill us in winter. I actually relaxed for the first time in what felt like months. That feeling lasted until I saw my mother near the bar talking to one of the investors, and even from across the room, I recognized the posture immediately. The laugh, the hand on the arm, the particular warmth she deployed whenever she wanted social ownership over a conversation. I told myself not to overreact. Then I walked close enough to hear her say, when Nathan first started the company from my house, I told him he'd never survive without family support. And then, we basically built this thing together. I stepped into the conversation immediately, said, "Mom, can I talk to you for a second?" as calmly as I could manage, and she smiled at the investor and said, "See, always working." And the investor laughed awkwardly and excused himself because even strangers could feel what was building underneath the surface. The second he walked away, her smile dropped. I said we had talked about this. She said, "About what?" I said, "About presenting herself like management." Her expression hardened. She said, "Oh my God, not here." I said, "Yes, here," which surprised her, because normally I waited and delayed and avoided scenes. But something about hearing her rewrite the company story directly to an investor inside the office we spent years building pushed me past the point where silence still felt responsible. She crossed her arms and said I was acting embarrassed by her again. I said this wasn't embarrassment, it was a boundary. She said there was that word. Then she lowered her voice and said I had really changed since money started coming in. And even though I knew that sentence was designed specifically to sting, because in my family, every achievement eventually became evidence that you were becoming colder, more arrogant, more selfish, like ambition itself represented betrayal. Once it stopped needing permission, it still landed. I kept my voice controlled and said she could not tell investors she built the company. She said she did help build it. I said no. I said, quietly but clearly, she helped me survive long enough to build it. The silence afterward had weight. For the first time, I had corrected the mythology directly rather than carefully dancing around its edges. She stared at me for a long moment, and then said, "So after everything I sacrificed, I deserve nothing," and said it loud enough that nearby employees started glancing over. I looked around the room and understood immediately what was happening. She was escalating publicly because public pressure had always been her most reliable instrument, and if enough people watched, I usually folded just to stop the discomfort spreading further. Only this time something inside me stopped cooperating with that instinct. She stepped closer and said I had lived in her house. She had given me money. She had fed me. And now I was acting like she was a stranger trying to steal from me. Several conversations nearby had gone quiet. Maya had appeared near the hallway entrance watching without interrupting. My father stood at the drinks table holding a beer he had clearly forgotten about. Then my mother said, "You wouldn't even have a company without me." And that one landed differently. Not emotionally, but structurally. Because suddenly I realized this was no longer misunderstanding or overattachment. She genuinely believed partial ownership already existed morally, whether legal paperwork reflected it or not. And if I gave in publicly now, even slightly, the company would never fully belong to itself again. I looked at her while the room stayed quiet and said, "Helping someone survive the beginning doesn't make you owner of everything they build afterward." Nobody moved after that. Not employees, not relatives, not my mother. Because suddenly the entire emotional architecture underneath the dynamic became visible all at once. The loans, the guilt, the constant story rewriting, the ownership language, the after everything as leverage. My mother's face flushed. She said, "I'm your mother." I said, "Yes, not my business partner." My sister Alyssa rushed over immediately and told me what was wrong with me. That Mom had helped me build the company from nothing. I said, "No, Mom helped me while I built it. Alyssa said that was the same thing. I said it wasn't. And honestly, that was the first time I heard so clearly how deeply my family had confused support with ownership. In their minds, helping created permanent claims, sacrifice created access, survival assistance created entitlement. My mother's voice cracked, and she said, "So all those years meant nothing." And even then, even after everything, some part of me almost gave in, because underneath all the manipulation sat something real and painful. She genuinely wanted her sacrifices recognized. She wanted significance and connection to the success. She wanted proof that what she had done mattered. The tragedy was that none of those things required ownership. But ownership was the only form she respected. I softened my voice slightly and said I was always grateful. She said, "Clearly not." I said I was, but gratitude didn't mean surrendering my company. Then I left. After the launch event, the office was different for weeks. Not hostile exactly, but aware. Before that night, most employees only knew my mother as the loud, overly proud parent who occasionally brought pastries and talked too long to reception staff. After the confrontation, people understood there was actual structural tension underneath the family support stories. Louise stopped joking about my mother becoming company president. Jenna started checking before letting relatives into office areas. Vendors who had previously entertained my mother's visits became noticeably more formal when she appeared near the building. The illusion was broken publicly, and she absolutely hated that. The first major explosion came less than 48 hours later. I was reviewing onboarding schedules when my phone started vibrating nonstop. 12 missed calls, all from my mother. Then a voicemail in a voice tight with fury. "You humiliated me in front of strangers after everything I've done for you." No acknowledgement of the actual issue. No reflection on the behavior that caused it. Only the humiliation. That told me everything about where we actually were. Because people who hurt you accidentally eventually discuss behavior. People who feel entitled to the behavior discuss only your reaction to it. I didn't call back. That mattered more than I realized at the time, because historically inside my family, silence always ended first with me. I usually apologized just to restore emotional stability, even when I knew I wasn't wrong. This time I didn't. By Tuesday, Alyssa was texting, "Mom's devastated. You seriously embarrassed her. You're acting like she tried stealing from you." That last message irritated me specifically because it perfectly summarized the family logic. If the behavior stopped short of literal criminality, apparently I had no grounds for a strong reaction. I answered once. She was presenting herself like ownership existed where it doesn't. Alyssa replied almost immediately. "Because she helped you." I stared at the screen for a long time before finally sitting with something I had been resisting for months. Inside my family, help was never allowed to remain fully in the past. Support always stayed alive as leverage available for future use. The loans during the startup phase, the bedroom, the reminders, the public storytelling, the our business language, the expectation of access. None of it was random. It was emotional equity collection. Help given freely on the surface, but recorded underneath. The situation escalated from exhausting to professionally dangerous about a week later. Jenna knocked on my office door looking nervous in a way I'd only seen twice before, both times during major client crises. There was a situation in reception. I walked out to find my mother sitting on the couch talking loudly to one of the warehouse vendors while holding printed company brochures she'd apparently taken from the lobby display, and she was giving career advice about my employees to outsiders. The vendor looked deeply uncomfortable when he saw me approaching. My mother smiled and said, "There he is," and when I asked what she was doing there, she held up 2 bags from a marina cafe and said she'd brought lunch, and then added casually that she was just explaining some company history. I asked to speak privately. The second the conference room door closed, the performance disappeared entirely. Smile gone. Eyes hardened. The warmth she deployed for audiences evaporating immediately once the audience was no longer there. She said I had embarrassed her. I said we had already talked about this. She said no. I had talked at her, which was her way of saying she had heard the words and rejected them without processing them, which was different from not having been told. I remember standing there looking through the glass wall at employees pretending not to notice the argument happening 10 feet away, and I thought about how much energy everyone in the office spent managing around this particular situation. The careful glances, the strategic exits, the deliberate deafness. and understood with absolute clarity that none of this would stabilize on its own. There would always be another scene, another ambush, another public pressure attempt, because my mother still believed time and guilt would eventually wear me down if she simply refused to accept reality long enough. She had been right about that for years, which was part of why she kept trying. She said she deserved recognition. And something about that sentence, the genuine human need buried inside the manipulation, the exhausted parent terrified of becoming irrelevant while her children built lives that no longer centered around her, almost reached me emotionally even then. I sat with it for a moment. Those feelings were real. They were also not the same thing as a right to ownership of my company, and understanding that distinction clearly enough to hold it steady while she was crying across the table from me was the hardest single thing about the whole situation. I answered carefully, "You deserve appreciation. That's different." Her face changed immediately, and she said I thought I was better than everyone now. And that sentence, predictable as it was, because every family boundary eventually transforms into arrogance accusations once guilt stops working, finally ended the conversation emotionally for me. Not because it hurt, because I recognized it precisely for what it was. I sat down across from her. "No," I said, "I just finally understand the difference between gratitude and surrender." The silence afterward felt heavy. Then she started crying. Not dramatic, not loud, almost worse. Quiet crying. The kind that makes you see the person behind the behavior rather than just the behavior itself. I saw the version of her I used to protect instinctively. The exhausted mother, the stressed parent, the woman who had poured years into raising someone and was watching him become increasingly difficult to control, which felt to her like being left behind. That was real, and it sat alongside everything else that was also real, and neither of those things canceled the other out. She looked at me through tears and asked what happens now. I explained as calmly as I could manage. She would no longer visit the office unannounced. She would not present herself as part of ownership. Employees had instructions not to share internal information with her, and legally and structurally the company belonged solely to me and the people actually working inside it. She stared at me like I'd slapped her. Then she said I was cutting out my own mother over paperwork. I shook my head. I'm protecting my life from someone who thinks helping me once means owning me forever. That sentence ended everything. Not instantly, but permanently. After that, contact became colder, less frequent, more performative. Alyssa stopped speaking to me except for occasional guilt messages at holidays. My father sent awkward neutral texts pretending the family had gone through a rough patch. Meanwhile, the company stabilized in ways that had previously felt impossible. The office became calmer once employees no longer worried about surprise family appearances. Clients stopped receiving mixed signals. The business finally felt structurally separate from my family for the first time since it existed. And I started sleeping better, which was the thing that surprised me most. I hadn't realized how much low-level anxiety I'd been carrying constantly, waiting for the next emotional ambush, until the ambushes stopped. I want to be honest about the months that followed, because the story people tell about cutting contact with family usually goes one of two ways. Either it's triumphant, or it's devastating, and mine was neither of those cleanly. Some things got better immediately. The office calmed down. Employees stopped tensing whenever they heard the lobby door open unexpectedly. Clients got consistent information. I stopped carrying that specific low-grade anxiety of never knowing when the next emotional ambush was coming. Those improvements were real, and I noticed them, and they mattered. Other things were harder. My father kept texting periodically. Careful, neutral messages about weather or sports, pointedly not mentioning anything real, which was somehow lonelier than silence would have been because it kept the door open to a version of the relationship that existed in the texts, but not in any conversation we were actually able to have. Alyssa sent a message at Christmas that said, "I hope you're okay," without any context, and I didn't know whether it was an olive branch or another pressure attempt, and I still don't. I thought about my mother sometimes in the way you think about something that shaped you in ways you're still discovering. Not with rage, not with relief, just with the complicated awareness that real people are rarely only one thing. Months later, Maya and I sat near the harbor after work watching cargo lights move slowly across the water while cold wind pushed faint restaurant music across the marina. She asked quietly whether I regretted any of it. I sat with the question longer than I expected to. I thought about my mother crying in the conference room, about the launch event, About years of guilt and obligation tangled together so tightly I'd stopped knowing where gratitude ended and ownership began. Then I answered honestly. I regret that saying thank you was never enough. Because I was genuinely grateful for the help during the beginning. I still am. The problem was never the help itself. The problem was what the help became afterward in her mind. Not a gift given freely, but a claim filed quietly, sitting there waiting to be collected once the thing it helped create was finally worth collecting. Every loan, every spare bedroom, every casserole. She had been keeping a ledger I didn't know existed, in a currency I didn't know we were trading in. Some people don't support your dream because they believe in you. They support it because they're already imagining the part that belongs to them. And once success arrives and the claim comes due, the most disorienting thing isn't the audacity of the ask. It's realizing the transaction was always happening, right there underneath what you thought was just love.